Every mother in Harlan County had warned her daughters about Homer Whitaker, and every one of those daughters had listened. Everyone except Lillian Easton, who had never been particularly good at listening to warnings. The year was 1881, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of everything civilized, balanced on the border between the settled East and the wild, breathing frontier that stretched southward into Indian territory. It was a cattle town, noisy and dusty and alive in ways that both thrilled and terrified those who passed through it. The Kishome Trail still carried longhorns up from Texas in those days, and drovers and cowboys and all manner of rough men filled the saloons on Chestnut Street every summer and autumn. By the time winter came and stripped the prairies bare, the town exhaled and the permanent residents settled into a quieter, more watchful version of themselves. Lillian Easton arrived in Caldwell in November of 1880, riding in the back of her father's wagon with her younger sister, Clara pressed against her shoulder, and their mother Margaret seated up front, clutching her Sunday hat against the wind. Edmund Easton had purchased a dry goods store from a man named Beaumont, who had decided that Kansas was trying to kill him, and had left for Missouri without looking back. Edmund was not a man who frightened easily, and he had decided that Caldwell was a place where a man with good stock and fair prices could build something lasting. He was right about that mostly. The store did well from the beginning. The Easton family settled into a two-story clapboard house on the north end of Main Street, and Margaret Easton wasted no time introducing herself to every woman of standing in town. By Christmas, she had established herself as a capable organizer, a reliable churchgoer, and a woman of distinct opinions about the appropriate behavior of young women on the frontier. Clara, who was 17 and prettily terrified of everything beyond the front porch, suited their mother perfectly. Lillian, who was 22 and thought the prairie the most magnificent thing she had ever seen, suited her mother considerably less. It was at the Christmas social, held in the Caldwell Grange Hall, that Lillian first heard the name Homer Whitaker spoken aloud, and it was spoken not with any warmth. She had been standing near the cider table, half listening to a conversation between her mother and a woman named Dorothea Crane, who was the wife of the town's most prominent banker, and who considered herself therefore the arbiter of all social matters in Harlan County. "The Whitaker boy was in town again last week," Dorothea said, dropping her voice in a way that suggested she wanted everyone within 10 feet to hear her. "Rode in with a load of pelts. Looked like he had not seen a razor in 6 months, or a bath." Margaret Easton made a sound that suggested sympathy with this concern. "Is he the one with the property out on Comanche Creek?" "That very one. Inherited it from his uncle, who was not much better, God rest him. Homer Whitaker has had every opportunity to make something of himself, and he has chosen instead to live like a savage. He traps and he hunts and he rides that half-wild horse of his all over the county, and he owns precisely one good shirt, which he wears to church at Easter, and that is the whole of his social ambition." Dorothea sipped her cider. "I had a conversation with Hester Mallory about whether she might consider encouraging an introduction between him and her oldest girl, and Hester nearly fainted at the suggestion. He is that bad. He is that unserious. A woman would be marrying a man who might disappear into the wilderness for weeks at a stretch and come home smelling of beaver and wood smoke, and expecting her to be grateful. No, thank you. I have told my Pauline that Homer Whitaker is not a prospect, and she is not to waste a single sympathetic thought on him." Lillian said nothing. She poured herself more cider and looked out the frosted window at the dark Kansas sky, thick with stars, and thought privately that a man who knew the wilderness well enough to disappear into it sounded considerably more interesting than most of the men currently standing around the Grange Hall looking earnest and overdressed. She did not seek Homer Whitaker out. She was not that reckless, or at least she told herself she was not. But the town of Caldwell was not large, and by February she had seen him 3 times. The first time was at the General Merchant on 2nd Street, where he stood at the counter buying flour and coffee and cartridges with the calm efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he needed and did not intend to linger. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his coat, and a jaw that had seen a razor recently enough that she revised Dorothea Crane's assessment somewhat. His clothes were plain and worn but clean. He moved with the unhurried ease of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and found indoor spaces mildly puzzling. He glanced at her once when she entered the store, just briefly, a calm, measuring look, and then he went back to his transaction. She found herself noticing that his eyes were gray, the particular gray of the sky over the prairie just before a winter storm. The second time was at the feed store, where she had gone with her father to arrange a delivery. Homer Whitaker was loading sacks onto a mule with methodical competence, and he touched the brim of his hat to her father and said, "Morning, Mr. Easton," in a voice that was low and unhurried. Her father, who had not yet absorbed the full weight of Dorothea Crane's opinion, said good morning back and made a comment about the cold, and Homer Whitaker agreed that it was cold and that the creek had frozen 3 inches thick, which he said like a man who had personally measured it. "That is Homer Whitaker," her father said afterward, with no particular judgment in his voice. "I know," Lillian said. "I have heard of him. Good worker by all accounts, keeps to himself." Keeps to himself is a crime, according to Mrs. Crane. Edmund Easton gave his daughter a sideways look that contained a great deal of fatherly amusement. Mrs. Crane considers breathing without prior permission something of an infraction. The third time was in March, when the cold was beginning to release its grip on the county, and the prairie grasses showed the first faint suggestions of green. Lillian had walked out along the road east of town, farther than was strictly advisable for a woman alone, but the afternoon was clear and warm, and she had been sitting behind a counter for 3 days straight, and she felt that she might turn into a piece of dry goods herself if she did not move her legs. She had a habit, carried over from her childhood in Missouri, of walking when the world felt too small, and Caldwell could feel very small on certain afternoons. She had gone perhaps a mile and a half east when she heard the sound of a horse approaching at an easy lope from the south, and Homer Whitaker came over a rise with a dead turkey draped across the back of his saddle, and his rifle in the scabbard, and that big gray horse moving in a way that suggested it was enjoying itself. He slowed when he saw her, which was polite, and then he stopped. "Miss Easton," he said, which surprised her because she had not known he knew her name. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. He looked at her, then at the empty road behind her, then at the sky, which was the wide, uncomplicated blue of a Kansas spring afternoon. "You are some ways from town," he said, not accusatory, just observational. "Yes," she said. "Walking for pleasure. Walking to stay sane," she said honestly, and then felt a flicker of self-consciousness because that was perhaps too candid a thing to say to a man she had exchanged approximately 12 words with total. But Homer Whitaker nodded like that made perfect sense. "The store can get close," he said. "I expect a dry goods store is worse than most. The bolts of calico start to look the same after a while." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "You are not from here originally," he said. "Missouri. We came in November." He looked at the prairie around them with an expression she would come to recognize over the following months as one of genuine love, the way a man looks at something he chose and would choose again. "The spring out here is different from Missouri spring," he said. "Give it another month. The whole county turns." She looked at the horizon, at the long, flat, golden-green line of it, and felt something stir in her chest that had nothing to do with being practical or sensible. "I believe you," she said. He touched the brim of his hat again, clucked to his horse, and rode on toward town. She stood in the road and watched him go and thought, well, he is not what Dorothea Crane described at all. The social season of Caldwell in 1881 was not a complicated affair, but it was persistent. There were church suppers and barn raisings and a dance in April at the Grange Hall for the planting season, and at every one of these events Lillian Easton observed the same phenomenon. Homer Whitaker would appear, clean and quiet, and every mother in attendance would subtly steer her daughters away from him, the way a shepherd steers lambs away from a gap in a fence. The daughters themselves tended to comply, either out of obedience or out of the vague unease that comes from being told for years that someone is unsuitable and absorbing that verdict without examining it. Lillian did not steer away. At the April dance, she found herself standing near the wall when the dancing paused between sets and Homer Whitaker was standing 3 feet away from her with a cup of lemonade, looking like a man who had come because it was expected and intended to leave at the earliest reasonable opportunity. She said, "Did the spring turn the way you said it would?" He looked at her with that calm, measuring expression. "You remembered that. You told me to give it a month and the county would turn. It has been a month and 2 weeks. Then you have seen it by now." "I have. You were right. It is different from Missouri spring." She paused. "It is more serious somehow, like the land means it." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the feeling he was actually thinking about what she had said rather than preparing a polite response. "The prairie does not do things halfway," he said finally. "Not winter and not spring and not summer. When it gets warm out here, it gets warm like it is making a point." "You love it," she said, because it was evident and she saw no reason to circle around the obvious. "Yes," he said, simply and without any defensiveness, and she found that directness more attractive than any amount of flattery would have been. Her mother appeared at her elbow within 60 seconds, which was approximately 58 seconds faster than Lillian had hoped. "Lillian, dear, Mrs. Hargrove is asking after you." She smiled at Homer Whitaker with the practiced warmth of a woman who had learned to be pleasant to everyone without necessarily meaning it. "Good evening, Mr. Whitaker." "Ma'am," he said and stepped away. In the carriage going home, Margaret Easton said, "I noticed you were speaking with Homer Whitaker." "Briefly," Lillian said. "He is not a suitable prospect, Lillian. I want to make that clear before you develop any ideas." I was not aware that a 2-minute conversation constituted developing ideas. With some conversations, it only takes 1 minute. Margaret smoothed her gloves. "He has no steady income, no standing in the community, and from what Dorothea Crane tells me, he has refused 3 direct opportunities for proper employment and gone back to trapping and hunting every time. He is 28 years old and he has nothing to show for it but a creekside property and some furs." "He owns his land," Lillian said, carefully neutral. "A lot of disreputable men own land. That is not the same as having a life built." Lillian said nothing more, but she looked out the carriage window at the dark sky full of stars and thought about the way Homer Whitaker had said the prairie does not do things halfway, and she thought he had not said it like a man with nothing built. He had said it like a man who had looked at the world and made an honest accounting of it and staked himself to something real. April became May, and May had its own kind of magic on the Kansas plains. The grasses came in thick, and the cottonwoods along the creeks leafed out in a color so fresh and bright, it seemed almost implausible. The cattle drives began coming up from Texas again, and Caldwell put on its rowdier face for the season, the saloons getting loud, the drovers spending freely, the respectable citizens walking a little faster past certain establishments. Lillian ran her father's store 3 days a week, handling the accounts and the ordering because she was better at numbers than either her father or the hired boy, Ezra, who was 16, and had the mathematical confidence of someone who had never actually been wrong enough times to be humbled by it. She liked the work. She liked the ordering and the inventory and the way a well-kept ledger reflected a well-run operation. She was good at practical things, which her mother sometimes seemed to regard as faintly regrettable, as though being good at practical things was a consolation prize for women who might otherwise have been more decorative. It was in the 2nd week of May that Homer Whitaker came into the Easton store for the first time. He came in the morning, when her father was at the mill, and Ezra was in the back room unpacking crates, and Lillian was alone at the counter working through the week's receipts. The bell above the door announced him, and she looked up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker. What can I help you with?" He held his hat in his hands, which she noticed, because it was a gesture of a certain kind of respect. He looked around the store with what appeared to be genuine interest at the bolts of fabric, the bins of dry goods, the hardware on the back wall. "I heard your father carries surveying supplies," he said. "We do. What do you need?" "A new measuring chain if you have it. Mine is rusted through." She went to the back cabinet where the surveying equipment was kept. Not a large selection, but a serviceable one, and found 2 measuring chains. She brought them to the counter, and he examined them seriously, testing the links between his fingers with the careful attention of a man who used tools and understood them. "The longer one," he said. She wrote it in the ledger. He paid in coin exact without having to search for it. "You are surveying your property?" she asked, because she was curious, and she had decided that being curious was not the same as being forward. "Adding a room to the house," he said. "I want to know the exact square footage before I start on the foundation so I do not waste lumber." "What kind of room?" He paused, as though the question surprised him slightly. "A proper kitchen," he said. "The one I have is a lean-to affair that barely keeps the weather out. I have been meaning to build a real one for 3 years." She thought about a man who planned additions to his house 3 years in advance and executed them carefully, who measured before he cut and bought exactly what he needed, and she thought that did not sound like a man who had nothing built. It sounded like a man who built things slowly and well. "That sounds like a worthwhile project," she said. He looked at her for a moment, that direct gray-eyed look that never felt intrusive, just honest. "Most people in town seem surprised I am doing anything with the house at all," he said. "Most people in town have formed their opinions about you and stopped gathering new information," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not quite surprise, something warmer. "That is a generous reading of it," he said. "It is an accurate one," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I expect your father will need some help moving a load of freight next week. I have a wagon and a strong back, and he can have both for an afternoon." It was a slightly sideways thing to offer, and they both knew it. She met his gaze steadily. "I will tell him. I am sure he will appreciate it." Homer put his hat back on, touched the brim, and went out into the May sunshine. Ezra came out of the back room a minute later dragging a crate and said, "Was that Homer Whitaker?" "It was," Lillian said, and went back to her ledger. "My ma says he is trouble. Your mother and approximately every other mother in the county," Lillian said pleasantly. "Hand me the shipping manifests, please." Homer Whitaker did help with the freight the following Tuesday, arriving with his wagon at precisely the time he had said he would, which Lillian noted because men who arrived when they said they would were less common than they should have been. He and her father loaded and unloaded 2 heavy shipments of barrel goods and hardware with efficient good cheer, and when they were done, Edmund Easton offered him a meal, which Homer accepted with a quietness that suggested he was not often asked. Lillian made the meal, fried salt pork and cornbread and butter beans from a jar, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table, and her father, who was a naturally sociable man, free of the more complicated social prejudices his wife carried, asked Homer about his property on Comanche Creek and got considerably more back in return than Lillian suspected most people did. Homer described the land with the precision and affection of a man who walked every inch of it regularly. He had 60 acres in total, 20 of which he had cleared and was hoping to put to hay next year. He had a kitchen garden that he was expanding. He had 2 horses, 6 cattle, a dozen chickens, and trapping lines along the creek that he ran from October through February. He sold the pelts in Caldwell, and the cattle money went back into the property. He was not getting rich, but he was getting further ahead each year than the year before, and he said this without pride or defensiveness, just as a plain accounting. Edmund Easton listened with the interest of a man who had built his own thing from a start and recognized the signs of it in others. "You are doing all of that alone," he said. "Have been," Homer said. "My uncle left the place to me 4 years ago in some disrepair. I have been working it back up." That is respectable work." Homer looked slightly startled to hear it put that directly, which told Lillian something about how often he was told so. "Thank you," he said. After he had gone, her father sat in the kitchen with his coffee and said, "He is a good man, I think. Serious-minded." "Yes," Lillian said. Her father looked at her with that sideways amusement again. "Your mother is going to tell me I am wrong about this," he said. "She very well might. Mothers have been wrong before. I will not tell her you said that." Edmund Easton laughed into his coffee. Through May and into June, a particular pattern established itself, natural and unhurried as the turning of seasons. Homer Whitaker came into the store on an irregular but increasingly frequent basis. Sometimes he needed supplies. Sometimes, and this grew more apparent as the weeks passed, he did not need much of anything but came in anyway. He would buy a small thing, a box of matches or a length of rope, and he would linger a few minutes at the counter and they would talk. About the property, about the weather, about books. He read more than she expected, practical volumes on agriculture and surveying and land management, but also novels, which surprised her, Dickens and Cooper, and a collection of essays by a New England writer she had never encountered. About the town and the cattle trade and the changes coming to the territory now that the railroad had consolidated its hold on the region, and the open range was starting to close in around the edges. She looked forward to those conversations, with a keenness that she was aware was significant, and chose not to examine too closely in the privacy of her own thoughts. One afternoon in late June, after a thunderstorm had driven her off the store porch where she had been sitting with the account books, she found herself inside watching the rain come down in silver sheets against the windows, and Homer Whitaker came in out of it, shaking water from his hat, and said, "That came fast." "It always does," she said. He looked at the books she had been working on, spread across the counter. "You do the accounts for the store. My father is better with customers than with numbers." "I am better with numbers than with customers, generally speaking." He picked up the nearest ledger with a questioning look first, which she appreciated, and looked at it with the focused attention he gave everything. "This is well organized," he said. "Thank you. I have been making a mess of my own accounts for 4 years," he said. "I know what I spend and what I earn, but I cannot seem to get it into a form that tells me anything useful." "I could look at it if you like," she said. "Sometimes a second pair of eyes can find the pattern." He looked at her steadily for a moment. The rain hammered the windows. "I would appreciate that," he said. He brought the accounts the following Saturday, a battered ledger, and a stack of receipts that he had at least kept together, which she told him was a better start than most. She spread them out on the counter after closing, and he stood beside her, and they went through 4 years of Homer Whitaker's financial life together. And what she found was not a mess so much as a system that had never quite been explained to itself. The trapping income and the cattle income and the lumber income from the timber he occasionally cut and sold were all commingled without clear categories, and the expenses were listed chronologically rather than by type, so the picture was blurry. She organized it as she read, making notes, and he watched and asked intelligent questions and understood the answers quickly. They were there past dark, and her father had to come and knock on the locked store door to ask if she was coming home for supper. And when Edmund Easton found them bent over the counter with ledgers and lamplight and perfectly appropriate distance between them, he said nothing alarming, but his expression was thoughtful. At supper her mother said, "I heard Mr. Whitaker was at the store late. He brought his accounts," Lillian said. "They needed organizing. Is that a service your father's store provides now?" "I offered," Lillian said evenly. "He needed help and I could provide it." Margaret Easton looked at her eldest daughter with the expression of a woman who sees something coming and is calculating how much she can redirect it. "Lillian," she said, "I want to speak plainly. I wish you would. Homer Whitaker has a reputation in this community that reflects on anyone he is associated with. His uncle before him was a rough sort of man who had no regard for conventions, and Homer has followed that example. He is not socialized into the kind of life that a well-brought woman deserves. He will always prefer that land and those creekside trails to a settled domestic existence. He is not the kind of man who builds a real life. Lillian set down her fork. She was a person of even temper ordinarily, but she felt a heat in her chest that had been building for weeks, building since the Christmas social when she had first heard his name spoken like something to be stepped around. He is currently building a kitchen, she said. A kitchen does not constitute a life. It constitutes a beginning of one, which is more than nothing. She picked her fork back up. I am 22 years old, Mother. I am not making any decisions. I am helping a neighbor with his accounts. I would appreciate it if that were allowed to be the simple thing that it is. Clara looked between them with wide eyes. Edmund Easton studied his plate with the focused attention of a man who had been married for 25 years and knew the exact value of careful silence. Margaret Easton said nothing more that evening, but the next morning she paid calls on Dorothea Crane and 2 other women of Caldwell society, and Lillian knew, without being told, that the subject of those calls was Homer Whitaker and her daughter's unaccountable interest in him. July was hot. The prairie turned brown and gold, and the heat shimmered off the flats in waves that made the distant tree line look like it was floating. The cattle drives brought their noise and smell to town, and the streets were busy, and the store was profitable, and Lillian worked her 3 days a week and walked her evening roads and continued to speak with Homer Whitaker when he came by. Something had shifted between them after the accounts. A comfort, a naturalness, the way 2 people who have sat together over a task and found they think alike begin to move more easily in each other's presence. He told her things about his days on the property, the hay he was cutting, a problem with a fence line on the east pasture, the hawk that had been raiding his chicken yard with what he described as impressive audacity. She told him about the store, about Ezra's latest mathematical miscalculation, about a letter from her friend in Missouri who was getting married to a law clerk and seemed to think this was the apex of human achievement. He laughed at that, a real laugh, low and genuine, and it was the first time she had heard it fully, and she felt it settle somewhere important. He began helping at the store unofficially and naturally, the way that sometimes happens when 2 people find themselves in each other's vicinity often enough that the helping becomes habitual. He would carry heavy stock in from a delivery wagon if he happened to be there. He fixed a broken porch step one afternoon without being asked, just found the tools and did it, and when her father thanked him, he said it was nothing and seemed mildly embarrassed by the gratitude. It was in the first week of August that Lillian rode out to his property for the first time. She had a reason. Her father had a standing order for 2 cords of split wood from a supplier who had canceled his fall delivery, and Homer had mentioned he cut timber and sometimes sold it. Edmund Easton, who was not unaware of the direction things were moving in his eldest daughter's life and had quietly made his peace with it, suggested she ride out and inquire about the wood. Margaret Easton was in Wichita visiting her sister for the week. Lillian rode her father's bay mare 5 miles east out of town, following the road to where it crossed Comanche Creek, and then turning south through Cottonwood bottomland, where the air was 10 degrees cooler and smelled of water and green things. The property appeared around a bend in the creek like something that had grown there rather than been built. A solid 2-story house of rough-hewn limestone, not large but well-proportioned, with a new section of foundation visible on the south side where the kitchen was going in. There was a barn in good repair, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden that was extravagantly productive for one man's effort, and a general sense of things being tended carefully. Homer came out of the barn when he heard the horse, and the look on his face when he saw her was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him, a quick, uncontrolled brightness, there and then smoothed into his usual calm, but she had seen it. She had been storing up small pieces of evidence like this for months, turning them over in quiet moments, and this was the clearest one yet. "Miss Easton," he said. She dismounted and tied the mare to the fence post and told him about the wood. They walked the property while he showed her the timber stand along the north edge, and then somehow they ended up sitting on the limestone wall along the kitchen garden with 2 cups of coffee. He made good coffee, strong and plain, and the afternoon extended around them like something that had no particular need to end. She looked at the house, at the new foundation going in, at the garden, at the barn, at the hay stacked under the lean-to for winter. "This is a life," she said. "What they say about you in town, that you have nothing built, they are not looking at this." Homer turned his cup in his hands, looking at the property with that quiet love. "I have stopped minding what they say," he said, "mostly, but not entirely. It gets tiring," he said, "to be told by people who do not know you that you are something less than what you are." She looked at him directly. "You are not something less than what you are." He was quiet for a moment. The cottonwoods murmured along the creek. A hawk, possibly the audacious one, circled above the chicken yard, and he watched it with a resigned expression that made her smile. Then he looked at her, and the look was different this time. Not the measuring look, not the calm assessment. Something that had stopped calculating and arrived somewhere. "I am aware," he said quietly, "that every mother in this territory has advised their daughters against me." "I am aware of that too," she said, "your mother among them. My mother is a capable woman with several sincere misconceptions." He almost smiled. "You are not most daughters," he said. "No," she agreed. "I am not." The silence between them was comfortable and charged in equal measure. The afternoon light lay golden across the limestone and the garden and the man sitting beside her who had built this place with 4 years of careful work. And Lillian Easton, who had been told her whole life to be sensible, felt thoroughly and deliberately in love. "I should get back," she said at last, because she should. "I will see about that wood," he said, standing, handing her his cup to put on the porch, another natural small intimacy. "2 cords by October. That would suit us very well," she said. He helped her onto the mare. His hand was warm through her riding glove. She looked down at him and he looked up at her, and neither of them said anything that needed to be said with words. She rode back to Caldwell through the cottonwood shadows, with her heart doing something complicated and sure. Her mother returned from Wichita in the 2nd week of August and wasted no time. Dorothea Crane had apparently sent a letter during the week's absence, and the letter had covered Lillian's visit to the Whitaker property in what Lillian could only assume was comprehensive and editorial detail. Margaret Easton sat her daughter down at the kitchen table on a hot Tuesday afternoon and had what she described as a serious conversation. "Lillian, I have been patient," she began. "You have been strategic," Lillian said, with love but without softening it. Her mother looked momentarily disrupted. "I have tried to guide you gently, and I see that gentleness is not reaching you. So let me be plain. Homer Whitaker is not a suitable husband. He has no standing, no profession, no prospects beyond what he can scratch out of that creekside property, and no inclination to become anything other than what he is. You are a capable, educated, attractive young woman with choices. Do not foreclose those choices on a man who the entire community has rightly identified as unsuitable." Lillian folded her hands on the table. She looked at her mother, whom she loved genuinely and respected enormously in most of her attributes. "The entire community," she said, "is judging him by a standard that was never designed to capture what he actually is. They want a man who socializes correctly and wears the right clothes and talks about investments. Homer Whitaker does none of those things. What he does is work his land with integrity, speak honestly, keep his word, and understand the country he lives in more deeply than anyone I have met. Those are not small things. They are not sufficient things. I think they are sufficient. I think they may be the most important things." Lillian met her mother's eyes. "I am not asking your permission. I am telling you honestly that I have feelings for this man, and I intend to see where they lead. I hope you will come to see him as I do, because I would like your blessing when the time comes. But I will not change course to avoid a difficulty." Margaret Easton looked at her eldest daughter for a long moment with an expression that shifted through several things: frustration, fear, something that might have been reluctant recognition. "You are exactly like your father," she said at last. "I know," Lillian said. "I think that is a compliment." The evening of the last Saturday in August, Homer Whitaker appeared at the Easton door. He was wearing his good shirt, which everyone in Caldwell knew was reserved for occasions. His hat was in his hand. He asked to speak with Edmund Easton, and Edmund Easton received him in the front parlor with the quiet dignity of a man who had been expecting this, and had already made his own calculations. Lillian stayed in the kitchen with Clara, who whispered frantic, excited things and was shushed repeatedly. The conversation in the parlor took 20 minutes. She could not hear the words, but she heard the cadences: Homer's low, unhurried voice, her father's warmer, more demonstrative one, occasional pauses, no raised tones. When the parlor door opened and her father called her in, she set down the dish towel she had been wringing and went. Homer was standing by the fireplace, hat still in his hands. He looked at her when she came in with that brightness again, the unguarded kind, and this time he let it stay. "Miss Easton," he said, "I have spoken with your father, and he has given me his leave to speak with you. I would like to court you properly, if you are willing. I know that my situation is not what every person in this county would recommend. I know that I am not—" He stopped, took a breath. "I know that I am considered by most people to be a poor prospect. I cannot argue with most of the particulars they raise. What I can tell you is that I have land that I own and work and care for, that I am building something on that land that I intend to be lasting, that I have thought of very little besides you since March, and that I would court you honestly and without pretense if you will have me." It was the longest speech she had ever heard from him, and it was the most honest thing she had heard from anyone in recent memory. "Yes," she said, "I am very willing." Edmund Easton, leaning in the doorway, produced a look of deeply satisfied amusement. Margaret Easton, standing in the hallway beyond him where she had apparently also been waiting, produced an expression that was considerably more complicated and said nothing at all for the rest of the evening. September came in with cooler nights and a clarity to the air that made everything look freshly drawn. Homer Whitaker courted Lillian Easton with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to everything he undertook. He called at the house on Thursday and Sunday evenings, always on time, always with something small and thoughtful. Once a jar of honey from a wild hive he had found on the property, once a book he thought she would like, and had ordered from a Wichita bookseller, once, memorably, a single late wildflower from the creek bank, presented with a total lack of ceremony that made it more touching than a dozen formal bouquets would have been. They walked together, chaperoned at first by Clara, who was thrilled to be useful in this capacity until she found it boring, and then by a general understanding that both parties were adults of good character. They walked the road east of town, the same road where they had first spoken. They talked about everything. She learned that he had come to Caldwell from Missouri himself, 8 years earlier, at the age of 20, following his uncle who had moved west and staked a claim along the creek. She learned that his uncle, Frank Whitaker, had been a difficult man in some respects, not dishonest or violent but irregular, prone to solitary stretches, uninterested in community standing, and that this was where Homer's reputation had been born, in the shadow of an uncle that respectable Caldwell had found puzzling and therefore suspect. She learned that Homer had been educated through his 15th year at a school in Missouri, self-taught after that, and that he had a mind that liked precision and found it in mathematics and in the exact vocabulary of the land, the names of grasses, of hawks, of the strata of limestone along the creek. She told him about Missouri, about growing up the daughter of a merchant who moved his family twice before settling, about learning numbers from her grandfather who had kept books for a dry goods concern in St. Louis, about the way the frontier had called to her since she was a girl reading accounts of it in borrowed magazines. "You are not what I expected when I first heard of you," she told him one evening, walking the road with the harvest moon enormous above the eastern plains. "What did you expect?" "What everyone else expected me to expect, someone rough and hopeless. He considered this. "I am rough in some respects," he said. "You are plain," she said. "That is different from rough. Rough is careless. You are the most careful person I have ever met." He stopped walking and looked at her. The moonlight was extraordinary, the kind that the prairie seemed to generate its own way, as though the flat land gathered and amplified it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. I am going to ask you to marry me. Not tonight, I am not ready tonight. But I want you to know that is where I am heading so you can consider it and it does not come as a surprise." He looked at her steadily. "I believe you deserve to have all the information in advance." She stared at him for a moment, and then something in her chest turned over like the first warm earth of spring, and she laughed, a real, full laugh that she could not have suppressed if she had tried, not from amusement at his seriousness, but from the sheer relief and rightness of it. "Homer Whitaker," she said, "that is the most organized declaration of intent I have ever heard of." "I am an organized man," he said, and the smile that broke across his face was the fullest one she had seen from him, unguarded and warm and entirely worth the months of glimpsing pieces of it. "I will consider the information," she said. "Consider it well considered already." October came and brought the 2 cords of wood, split and stacked beside the Easton store, delivered by Homer with his wagon, and stacked by him and Edmund Easton together, in an afternoon that ended with supper at the kitchen table and Margaret Easton, who had been making an extended and visible effort to revise her assessment, actually asking Homer about the hay harvest and receiving a thorough and detailed answer that she appeared to find interesting despite herself. It was progress. Slow progress, the kind that has to grow under frost before it blooms, but real. The incident with Fletcher Hale occurred in mid-October, and it clarified several things. Fletcher Hale was a cattle broker out of Abilene who came through Caldwell twice a year, and who had, in the spring, identified Lillian Easton as someone he intended to court with the confident efficiency of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted without much resistance. He was prosperous and presentable and 40 years old, and he made no secret of the fact that a wife in Caldwell would suit his business interests. He had approached Edmund Easton in a roundabout way in September, and Edmund had told him without particular warmth that his daughter made her own considerations. In October, Hale came back through and heard about Homer Whitaker's courtship and took exception to it, not from sentiment but from the particular competitive irritation of a man who had been displaced by a rival he considered beneath him. He made his feelings known at the Lone Star Saloon with a volume and specificity that were intended to reach Caldwell's broader population, and what he said about Homer Whitaker was not merely dismissive but deliberately damaging accusations of claim jumping, of irregularities in the original acquisition of the Comanche Creek property, of a general dishonesty he implied was congenital. None of it was true. Lillian heard about it from Ezra, who had heard it from the farrier's boy, and she went directly to Homer. She found him at the feed store, which was where most relevant conversations in Caldwell eventually took place. He knew about it already. His expression was controlled and still, but there was a tension in his jaw that she had not seen before. "It is nonsense," she said. "Yes," he said. "Your uncle's deed on the property was recorded correctly. I have seen your accounts. I know exactly how that land was acquired." He looked at her. "You would say so publicly. I would stand on the steps of the courthouse and say so if it came to it," she said, "but it will not come to it. I am going to speak with Mr. Crane about this today. Lillian, Bernard Crane is the county recorder. He has the deed on file. Fletcher Hale is a cattle broker from Abilene who is behaving badly because he did not get what he wanted, and the fastest way to end this is to make his dishonesty visible to people who matter." She looked at him steadily. "Will you trust me to handle this?" He was quiet for a moment, and she knew that this was a thing of some cost for him to let someone else fight a battle on his behalf, to accept that kind of help. He was a man who had managed alone for 4 years and probably longer than that in spirit. "Yes," he said at last. I trust you." She went to Bernard Crane that afternoon. Bernard Crane was a precise and literal-minded man who kept meticulous records and had a professional distaste for the careless treatment of documented facts. He confirmed the Whitaker deed, stated clearly that it was in perfect order, and when Lillian explained what Fletcher Hale had been saying, he looked genuinely offended on behalf of the county recorder's office. Within 48 hours, he had spoken to 3 other significant men in Caldwell, and Fletcher Hale found himself on the receiving end of some pointed questions and a general cooling of business hospitality. He concluded his transactions in Caldwell faster than expected and left for Abilene without further comment on Homer Whitaker's character. Homer said nothing elaborate about it. He came to the store 2 days after Hale's departure, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that held everything he was not saying, and then he said, "Thank you." "You would have done the same," she said. "I would not have known to go to Crane," he said honestly. "That is why there are 2 of us," she said. He reached across the counter and took her hand, just for a moment, just a brief, sure pressure, and then he let go and went about his business, and Lillian turned back to the ledger with a warmth in her chest that she thought might be the most constant thing she had ever felt. November brought cold and the end of the cattle season, and Caldwell settled into its winter self. The cowboys went south or east, or wherever they went when the drives ended, and the saloons quieted, and the town turned its collar up against the wind and became something smaller and more sincere. Homer's trapping lines went in along the creek in the first week of November, and he would disappear for days at a stretch to run them, returning with furs and frozen cheeks and a tired satisfaction. The first time he was gone for 5 days, Lillian understood viscerally what her mother had meant, the particular anxiety of caring for someone who moves regularly into wilderness. But she understood it as something to be lived with, not a reason against. She was not a woman who wanted a man she could see and account for every hour. She wanted a man she could trust to go out and come back, and she had enough evidence now to know that Homer Whitaker was exactly that kind of man. He proposed on a Saturday in November the 22nd, which she knew would be the date they put in the family Bible. He came to the house in his good shirt and asked Edmund Easton formally, then came into the parlor where Lillian was sitting with a book she had entirely stopped reading an hour earlier. He sat across from her. He did not kneel, neither of them was theatrical by nature, but he looked at her with the full force of everything he was and said, "Lillian Easton, I am asking you to marry me. I cannot offer you wealth or standing or an easy social position. I can offer you a piece of land that I love and am making into something good, an honest life on it, complete fidelity to you, and my best effort every day at being the kind of man worth building a life beside. I believe you are the best person I have ever known, and I would like to spend the rest of my life in that knowledge." She had thought she would be composed. She was not entirely composed. Her voice was steady when she said yes, but her hands were not quite steady, and he crossed the room and took them in both of his. And that was that. Margaret Easton, called in by Edmund, stood in the parlor doorway and looked at her daughter and the man who was now her daughter's intended, and her expression was the most complicated thing Lillian had seen in a human face. There was resistance and grief, and something underneath both of those that was slowly, visibly working its way toward acceptance. After a long moment she said, "I hope you understand what a fine woman you have engaged yourself to, Mr. Whitaker." "I do," Homer said, without hesitation. Margaret looked at him for another moment. "Then I hope you prove worthy of it," she said, which was not a blessing but was the beginning of a path toward one. The engagement period of Caldwell, Kansas was a social institution with its own protocols, and those protocols were applied to Homer Whitaker and Lillian Easton with the full attention of the town's social infrastructure, which meant that the news spread within approximately 4 hours of the proposal and was the subject of comprehensive commentary within 12. Dorothea Crane's reaction was the most notable. She encountered Lillian at the millinery shop the following Monday and said, with more grace than Lillian had expected, I hear congratulations are in order." And then, after a pause that seemed to cost her something, "He helped my husband get his wagon out of the creek bottom last spring, you know. Did not ask for anything in return. I suppose that means something." "It means quite a lot," Lillian said. "Well," Dorothea straightened a hat that did not need straightening. "I suppose every generation has to decide for itself." There were others who were less gracious. But Lillian had spent a year building her own standing in Caldwell, and she had more allies than the disapproving women had calculated. The women who had watched her run the store accounts with competence and handle Fletcher Hale's slanders with precision did not line up behind Dorothea Crane's camp in any significant numbers. And Homer's own conduct over the previous months had been noted by those who were paying attention. The fence step, the freight hauling, the careful delivery of 2 cords of well-split wood, the honest, direct way he spoke to people that was, once you were accustomed to it, rather more pleasant than a good deal of the social performance going on around it. The wedding date was set for the second Saturday in April, which was almost 5 months away, and which everyone agreed was appropriate, enough time to prepare properly. Homer spent those months finishing the kitchen. He worked on it through December and January, the coldest months, coming into town to see her on Sunday evenings and arriving cold and covered in limestone dust and concrete lime, and she would bring him coffee and sit at the kitchen table of her father's house while he described the progress. The new walls were up, the roof was on. The fireplace and cookstove went in on the same weekend in January, and he came to tell her about it with a specific satisfaction in his face that she would remember the rest of her life. "You should come and see it," he said. She went in February, with both her parents this time, which was the appropriate form, and they toured the completed kitchen together in coats and scarves because it was Kansas February, and even the best insulated limestone was cold. It was a real kitchen, spacious, well-lit, with a proper cookstove and a work table he had built of heavy oak, shelves along the east wall, a window over the sink that looked out onto the kitchen garden. It smelled of fresh plaster and new wood and the particular clean cold of a winter day. Her mother stood in the middle of it for a long time, looking at the workmanship, at the plumb walls and the careful window casings and the strong, well-fitted floor, and when she turned to Homer Whitaker she said, with something in her voice that Lillian had not heard directed at him before, "You built this yourself?" "The masonry I had help with," Homer said. "Jed Flowers from out on the East Road is good with stone." "The rest I did." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "It is very well made," she said. "I wanted it to be right," Homer said. She looked at him, and Lillian watched her mother's face do something she had been hoping for since August. It opened, just slightly, past the wall of her certainties, and what showed through was a woman who was capable of being persuaded by evidence if the evidence was presented clearly enough and with enough patience. "I can see that," her mother said. The drive back to town in the wagon that afternoon was quiet, but a different kind of quiet than before. Her mother sat with Edmund and looked at the winter prairie and said, halfway to town, "He is a serious-minded person, your father tells me." "He is," Lillian said. "I was perhaps too quick," her mother said, which was as much as Margaret Easton had ever said about being wrong about anything, and Lillian knew it cost her and loved her for it. "He would like your good opinion," Lillian said gently. "He has not said so, but I know it." Her mother turned to look at her. "Then he shall have it," she said. "Earned fairly." The winter passed in the particular slow richness of an engaged couple in their last months of separateness. They wrote letters to each other in addition to their Sunday visits. Lillian had not expected this from him, but he was a careful writer, precise and real, with occasional dry observations about the wildlife on his property that made her laugh out loud and fold the letters up in a specific pocket of her coat. She wrote back with equal care, and he kept her letters, she would discover later, in a locked box in his study. January brought a blizzard that closed the roads for 4 days, and she was not able to see him. And on the 4th day she stood at the kitchen window watching the snow and admitted to herself with complete clarity that absence of him was a physical sensation, a specific lack, and that this was the clearest evidence yet of the nature and depth of what she felt. In February, she began planning the wedding in earnest. It would be at the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, which was where the Eastons attended, and which Homer accompanied them to with increasing regularity in the months preceding the date. The minister, Reverend Glass, was a small, deliberate man of genuine kindness, who asked them both sensible questions about their intentions and seemed satisfied with the answers. There would be a dinner at the Grange Hall afterward, organized by her mother with the thoroughness she brought to all organized endeavors, and which became, in the execution, something considerably more significant than the modest celebration they had originally discussed. Because a funny thing was happening, and Lillian watched it with private delight. As the wedding approached, as Homer Whitaker appeared regularly at church and at community events and in the store and at the Easton supper table, as people saw him in context and observed the way he spoke and kept his word and treated the people around him, the community of Caldwell was revising its assessment. Not loudly, not in any official way, but the mothers who had steered their daughters away began to nod to him on the street with genuine warmth instead of polite distance. The men who had dismissed him found reasons to consult him about weather patterns and game and the behavior of the creek in flood season, because he was the person who knew those things most accurately. And the word unmarriageable, which had attached to him like a burr for years, fell off quietly under the weight of contrary evidence. Dorothea Crane came to help with the wedding decorations. She did not make a speech about it. She simply appeared at the Grange Hall with ribbon and greenery in her capable hands and worked alongside Margaret Easton for an afternoon, and at one point she said to Lillian, who was arranging chairs, "Your young man fixed the Hargrove well pump last Tuesday. Did you know that?" "I did not," Lillian said. "Went over to tell them about a fence line encroachment. Noticed the pump was broken, fixed it before he left. Told Dale Hargrove it was a simple repair and that he was welcome." Dorothea snipped a length of ribbon with more force than the ribbon required. "I may have been somewhat rigid in my assessments." "We are all learning," Lillian said pleasantly. March came in warm for Kansas, which meant it was merely cold rather than brutal, and the prairie began its extraordinary spring conversion. The grasses greened from the roots up, and the cottonwoods along Comanche Creek put out their first pale leaves, and the sky took on that particular depth of blue that Homer had told her to watch for. She rode out to the property on a Thursday alone with the full, comfortable acceptance now of both families, and she walked the land with him in the early spring sunshine, the creek running with snowmelt, the chickens conducting their business in the yard, the new kitchen warm and smelling of the coffee he had put on when he heard her horse. "1 month," she said. "1 month," he agreed. They stood at the creek bank and watched the water run over the limestone shelves, and she felt the particular peace of a person who has made the right decision and knows it not from having reasoned through it, but from the full, settled conviction of the body and heart together. "Are you afraid of anything?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I am afraid of not being what you need," he said. "I know what I am. I know what I am not. I am afraid that some morning you will look up and want something I cannot give you." She turned to face him. "I have looked at you very carefully for a year," she said. "I have made an extensive accounting. What I have found is a man who builds what he says he will build, says what he means, and loves this land with a sincerity that I find more moving than I can articulate. Those are the things I need. I am not uncertain." He looked at her for a long moment in the spring light, the creek behind them, the pale new leaves overhead. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it in precisely those words, and she felt them the whole way through. "I love you too," she said. "I believe I have for quite some time." He took her face in his hands, those careful, capable hands, and he kissed her, there on the limestone bank of Comanche Creek, with the spring making itself known all around them, and it was the most natural thing in the world. The second Saturday of April 1882 was a day so perfect it seemed engineered for the occasion. The sky was the deep, innocent blue of the just-arrived Kansas spring, and the temperature was warm enough for spring clothes, but cool enough for comfort, which in Kansas was a coincidence rare enough to be noted in diaries. The cottonwoods along the creek had come fully into leaf in the preceding week, and the wildflowers on the East Road were out in force, the yellow and purple and white of them scattered across the greening pasture like something willfully optimistic. Every mother in Caldwell who had warned her daughter about Homer Whitaker was present at the ceremony. They came to the First Methodist Church dressed in their best, and they sat in the pews and they watched Homer Whitaker stand at the altar in a new coat, dark blue wool, well-fitted, purchased from a tailor in Wichita, replacing forever after the legendary single good shirt, and wait for Lillian Easton with an expression of such transparent and honest anticipation that the most resistant heart in the room would have had to soften toward him. Margaret Easton sat in the front pew beside her husband and held a small nosegay of prairie flowers that Homer had left on the Easton porch that morning with a note that said only, "For Mrs. Easton," with appreciation and respect, and she held those flowers through the whole ceremony with an expression of a woman engaged in a thorough and honest re-examination of herself. Lillian came down the aisle on her father's arm in a dress of ivory cotton voile that she and her mother had spent 3 weeks making, and she was not trembling and she was not looking at the floor. She was looking at Homer Whitaker, who was looking back at her, and the look between them was so complete and private that every person in the church felt it, and the room went quiet in a particular way that churches only go quiet when something genuinely true is happening. Edmund Easton put his daughter's hand in Homer Whitaker's hand and stepped back, and Homer held her hand the way he held everything he cared for, with care and sureness, and no intention of letting go. Reverend Glass read from the Book of Ruth, which was his preferred text for weddings, because it was about commitment that went beyond convenience and obligation, and his voice was the only sound in the full church. The vows were the traditional ones, and both of them said them clearly, Homer's low voice and Lillian's steady one, and when it was done and Reverend Glass said they were husband and wife and Homer kissed her, the church responded with a warmth that surprised even Lillian, who had believed in this day more than anyone. The dinner at the Grange Hall was everything her mother's organizational capacity could produce, which was considerable. There were tables covered in white cloth and prairie flowers in jars along every windowsill, and enough food to feed Caldwell twice over. There was fiddle music from Dale Hargrove and 2 of his friends, and dancing that went on until the lamps burned low. Homer danced with her twice and with her mother once, the second dance of which Margaret Easton accepted with an expression of complete intention to be gracious and a small private smile that Lillian noticed and saved. Dorothea Crane danced with her husband and watched the new couple from across the room and said to the woman beside her, "Well, I suppose I was wrong about Homer Whitaker." The woman beside her, who was Hester Mallory, said, "We were all wrong about Homer Whitaker." "I am not accustomed to being wrong," Dorothea said. "None of us are," Hester said. "That is rather the point, isn't it?" Clara danced with every young man who asked her and several who were too shy to ask until she provided the invitation, and she glowed with the borrowed happiness of the day, and whispered to Lillian during a pause between dances, "He looks at you like you are the whole of the world." "He does, rather," Lillian said, watching Homer across the hall where he was in conversation with her father and Jed Flowers, relaxed and present in a way that was different from how he had been at social events a year ago, not performing for anyone, simply himself in the company of people who knew him now. "I think I want that someday," Clara said softly. "You will have it," Lillian told her. "You have to stop listening to everything Mother says about suitable prospects, but you will have it." They drove out to the Comanche Creek property as evening came on, in Homer's wagon, with the last light golden across the plains and the first stars appearing in the east and the creek audible before they could see it. The house was lit inside with lamps Homer had left burning, and it sat there in the spring evening solid and sure, the new kitchen extension seamless now with the older stone of the original structure, the garden ready for its first planted season with Lillian's hand in it. He helped her down from the wagon. They stood in front of the house together for a moment, looking at it. "Home," he said. "Home," she agreed. They had a life to build. The first summer of their marriage taught them both what they had already suspected and some things they had not. They were compatible in the deep practical ways, in how they organized work and managed the property and kept accounts and made decisions. They were compatible in the quieter ways too, in how they sat together in the evenings, him reading, her with the account books or a letter, the lamplight warm and the creak audible through the open window, no particular need to fill the silence. They were surprised by each other occasionally, which was, Lillian decided, one of the best things about a long commitment, the ongoing discovery of a person who had already agreed to be known. She took over the property accounts formally in June, bringing the same organized precision she had applied to her father's store, and within 2 months she had identified 3 areas where they were spending more than necessary and 1 area, the timber stand, where they were leaving money unharvested. Homer looked at her analysis with the same focused attention he gave everything and said, "I knew those numbers were in there somewhere. I could not find them." "You were too close to it," she said. "You need someone whose first view of it is from the outside." "You are not outside it now," he said. "No," she said happily. "I am not." The hay harvest in July was the hardest physical work she had done in her life, and she did all of it, working beside Homer from early morning in the summer heat, cutting and turning and stacking, her arms and back aching in ways that revealed muscles she had not known she possessed. Homer worked with steady, unstoppable capability, and at the end of each day there was a specific companionship in shared exhaustion that she found unexpectedly beautiful. The stacked hay gleamed gold in the field against the blue sky, and she looked at it with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had made something real. She planted a proper kitchen garden that summer, larger than Homer's previous effort, with ambition and careful attention to the creek-enriched soil. Tomatoes and beans and squash and carrots, and an experimental section of sweet corn that succeeded beyond expectation. The chickens, whom she named after women of Greek mythology with a lack of irony that amused Homer considerably, were expanded to 2 dozen and became a source of income as well as eggs. Her mother came out to visit twice that summer, and both times she found something new to admire in the house and the property and said so, and both times she had a longer and more genuine conversation with Homer than the time before. By August, when Lillian mentioned casually that Homer had been helping Jed Flowers repair his barn roof in the afternoons after his own work was done, her mother said, "He is a generous man, with the simple directness of a woman who has reached a conclusion and arrived at peace with it." "He always was," Lillian said gently. "Yes," her mother said. "I know." By autumn the property was producing more than they needed for themselves, which had been Homer's quiet goal for 2 years before they married, and was now a goal they pursued together. The cattle, 4 head now, not 6, were healthy and well fed on the summer grass. The timber stand had been surveyed, and a plan made for selective cutting that would provide income without depleting the grove. The trapping lines went in again in November, and Lillian ran accounts for the first sales with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and found that Homer's trapping income, properly tracked and analyzed, was 30% better than he had realized. "You have been undervaluing yourself," she told him, showing him the numbers. He looked at the ledger with an expression that was somewhere between pleased and sheepish. "I was never much for the accounting part." "Fortunately," she said, "you married an accountant." He looked up at her with that smile, the full, warm one she had worked so hard to earn in the beginning, and which now came easily and often, and said, "I believe I had some fortune in general on that subject." In November she told him she was expecting a child. They were at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp lit, The first hard frost on the window, the evening as ordinary and complete as any of the evenings she had come to love. She told him directly, because that was how they communicated, and she watched his face go through several things very quickly, a flicker of something almost like surprise, though he had not been not expecting it, followed by something that settled into pure and quiet joy. He reached across the table and took her hands, the same gesture as that October day at the store counter, but now carrying a year of shared life. "A child," he said. "In the summer," she said. "July, I think." He sat for a moment with that, as he sat with everything significant, giving it the space it deserved. Then he said, "I am going to need to think about fencing the south pasture properly, and there is a patch of rot in the east bedroom floor that I have been meaning to address." She laughed so hard she nearly knocked the lamp off the table. "I tell you we are having a child and your first thoughts are fencing and flooring." "A man needs to prepare," he said, and he was smiling, and she could see behind the practicality all the love and readiness that the practicality was expressing on his behalf, because he was a man who showed love through readiness, through building and fixing and providing, and she had learned to read that language fluently. "The rot in the floor is a fair priority," she conceded, wiping her eyes. He stood up and came around the table and held her face in his hands the same way he had on the creek bank in March, and he kissed her forehead and said softly, "We are building something good." "We are," she said. "We have been from the beginning." The winter was gentle, as Kansas winters went, and Lillian stayed well and active through it. She continued the accounts and the correspondence and the garden planning for the following year, and rode with Homer when the weather permitted, shorter distances than before, but still the ride along the creek that she had come to love for its particular beauty in winter, the ice along the banks, the bare cottonwood silver against the sky, the hawks hunting the frozen fields. She was not a woman who retreated from the world because of a pregnancy, and Homer did not ask her to, though he watched her with a quiet attentiveness that she found endearing. Clara came to visit in February and was effusively delighted about the baby, and asked to hear every detail, and made Lillian laugh with her romantic speculations about names and appearances and temperament. She had a young man now herself, a steady farmer from the north end of the county named Robert Finch, who had none of the dramatic complications of Homer Whitaker's reputation, and who was pleasant and dependable and clearly devoted to Clara, and Lillian thought he was exactly right for her sister. Their mother had given her blessing promptly and with visible relief. Edmund and Margaret Easton were at the house for supper on the first Sunday of March, and Homer made a point, which Lillian saw him make deliberately, of thanking Margaret for the jar preserves she had brought and asking her advice about a specific matter in the kitchen garden, the aspect she had most commented on admiringly. And Margaret gave the advice readily and with pleasure, and Lillian thought, "This is what he has been doing for months, quietly and without making a performance of it, building something with her mother the same way he built everything, piece by careful piece." After supper, Edmund caught Lillian in the kitchen and said quietly, "Your mother told me last week that she was wrong about him." "I know," Lillian said. "She did not say it to you. She said it in her way. She brought the preserves." Edmund Easton nodded with the deep satisfaction of a man who had watched something develop correctly over a long time and was now seeing it complete. "He is a good man," he said. "He is a great one," she said. "The territory just did not know how to see it." The baby came in the first week of July, on a morning when the summer heat was just beginning to press against the house, and the creek was running low and clear. Homer had a woman from town, Mrs. Danforth, who served as the midwife for the county, and she was calm and capable, and at 7 in the morning she placed a boy in Homer Whitaker's arms, and he stood in the new kitchen of the house he had built, and held his son with the same care he brought to everything he valued, and looked at Lillian in the bed where they had brought her to rest, and said absolutely nothing, because there was nothing that words would improve. They named him Francis Edmund, for Homer's uncle who had started the land, and for Edmund Easton, who had received Homer Whitaker with honest decency when most of the county had not. Francis Edmund Whitaker had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn mouth, and from the first days of his life, he was interested in everything around him with an intensity that suggested he had inherited the best qualities of both his parents' intellects. Homer held him in the evenings on the porch, the summer dark coming down over the prairie and the first stars appearing, and he talked to the boy in his quiet voice about the land around them, about the creek and the hawk and the grasses and what the sky was doing. Lillian sat beside them and listened and thought, this is how it is transmitted, this love of the place, this serious attention to the world as it actually is. That fall the property turned its first genuine profit beyond living expenses, money they put into a savings account at the Caldwell Bank, Crane's Bank, which perhaps contained a small cosmic irony, for the improvement of the land and the future of the children they intended to have. Homer began cutting timber from the north stand with the selective method they had planned together, and the income was steady and respectable. The hay harvest was the best yet, selling the surplus to 2 ranches east of town. The trapping season came and went cleanly, and the fur income, properly tracked and fully realized, was better than any previous year. Clara married Robert Finch in November, a quiet ceremony in the same Methodist church, and Lillian stood with her sister in the front of that church with Francis on her hip, 8 months old and perfectly behaved, as though he understood the gravity of the occasion, and watched her sister married with the same completeness of feeling she had felt in her own ceremony. Homer danced at that wedding with his son in his arms, to the absolute delight of everyone present, including Dorothy Crane, who told the woman beside her that Homer Whitaker had turned out to be one of the finest men in the county, and she for one had always seen the potential. The woman beside her had the grace not to point out any prior statements to the contrary. 2 years after the wedding, in the spring of 1884, Lillian found herself sitting on the limestone wall of the kitchen garden on a Sunday afternoon with Francis, now almost 2, making his experimental way along the creek bank under his father's calm supervision. The wildflowers were out in force along the south pasture, and the sky was the deep spring blue, and the new calf in the barn had been named Dorothea by Lillian, with what she admitted was small private humor. She was expecting their second child, due in October, and she felt the particular settled fullness of a life that has achieved the thing it was reaching toward, not perfect, because nothing real was, but complete. Because she had what she had wanted when she had stood on the Caldwell Road in the spring of 1881 looking at the horizon. She had depth and truth and a person beside her who faced the world with honest eyes. Homer came up from the creek with Francis on his shoulders, the boy gripping his father's hair with alarming enthusiasm and conducting a one-sided conversation about the duck he had observed on the water. Homer deposited him beside Lillian on the wall and sat down himself, looking at the garden with his expression of quiet love. "The beans are coming in well," he said. "I know," she said. "I planted them in better soil this year, eastern section of the bed. Smart." He looked at the sky, the property, the creek, then at her. "I have been thinking about the north fence line. If we extend it by the end of this season, we could run 4 more head next year." "I have been thinking about the accounts," she said. "If we extend the north fence and add 4 head, we will see the returns by the following spring at the latest. The numbers support it." He nodded. "Then we do it in September." Francis, who had been examining a caterpillar with the focused intensity of a future scientist or naturalist, looked up and said with great conviction, "Duck." "Not a duck," Homer told him patiently. "A caterpillar." "Duck," Francis said again, with the confidence of the deeply committed. Lillian put her face in her hands and laughed. Homer put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and the spring spread itself out around them, golden and serious and alive in the way that the Kansas prairie had always been alive, not performing, not pretending, just fully and unreservedly itself. Every mother in the territory had been wrong about Homer Whitaker, and every one of them had, in their own way and in their own time, come to know it. The man they had called unmarriageable had built a kitchen for the woman he loved before he asked her to live in it. He had spoken honestly when honesty required more courage than silence. He had made his accounting of the world and been right about it, and he had waited for the one person who was looking closely enough to see it. The daughter who had disagreed with all of them, who had walked out on the East Road on a March afternoon looking for air, and found something altogether better, held her husband's hand on the limestone wall of their garden, and thought that if being sensible meant what her mother had originally meant by it, she was glad she had never been particularly good at it. Francis fell asleep on the garden wall between them, having exhausted himself in the pursuit of the possibly imaginary duck, and Homer lifted him without waking him and held him against his chest, and Lillian watched her husband hold their son in the afternoon light with the easy certainty of a man who had always known what mattered and had only been waiting for the world to catch up with him. The creek ran clear, and the cottonwoods turned in the spring wind, and the hawk, the audacious one or his descendant, there was no way of knowing, circled the chicken yard with its usual ambition, and the house of good limestone sat on its land solid and sure, the kitchen addition seamless now, years grown into the original stone, part of it, as if it had always been there. It had not always been there. It had been built. They had built it together, piece by piece and year by year, the way everything worthwhile is built, not in a single season but in the long, honest accumulation of days, each one added to the last until the whole of it is something neither of them could have made alone. That evening they sat on the porch in the last of the light, the baby sleeping inside and Francis in his bed and the prairie going dark and gold around them, and Homer said, "Do you ever regret it?" She looked at him. "Regret what?" "Any of it. The way it was said about me, the difficulties with your mother, the fact that this life is what it is and not something easier." She considered the question honestly, the way he had taught her to consider things, which was without flinching and without performing. "No," she said, "not for a single day." He looked at her for a long moment in the evening light, the gray eyes steady and warm and hers completely. "Neither do I," he said. The first stars appeared over the eastern plains, the same stars that had hung over the East Road the night of their engagement, the same stars that had watched the territory change and hold and breathe and become. The creek murmured in the dark below the house, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a night bird called and answered itself, and Lillian Easton Whitaker, who had never been good at listening to warnings, sat with her husband in the spring dark of Kansas and thought that all the mothers in the territory could have been right about him, and she would have disagreed anyway, because some things you know not from what you are told, but from what you see when you look long enough and honestly enough at the world as it actually is. She had looked, she had seen, and she had married him in the spring.